In the spring of 1982, the most important toy company in American history was sold to a television network. Not acquired by a competitor, not rescued by a visionary. Sold to a company that broadcast the evening news and ran soap operas. A company whose executives had never once stood in a toy aisle, never once watched a child's face change when the right box came off the shelf. The price was $58 million. The seller was 75 years old. The name on the door was Ideal. You may not recognize that name. That is the point. You know the teddy bear, you know Betsy Wetsy, you know the Evel Knievel stunt cycle, the Mousetrap board game, the Rubik's Cube. You spent Saturday mornings with their products, Christmas mornings unwrapping them, summer afternoons destroying them. You just never knew who made them. Ideal Toy Company built 8 decades of American childhood and somehow remained invisible the entire time. This is the story of how that invisibility killed them. Morris Mictum arrived in New York in 1887 with nothing that a customs officer would have recorded as valuable. He was 18 years old. He had come from Russia, from a Jewish family in a country that had made clear his kind were not welcome. He spoke little English. He had no trade connections, no capital, no family already established on the other side of the Atlantic. What he had was the thing that immigrant New York ran on in those years, a willingness to work at any hour, in any weather, for any margin that kept the lights on. He found his footing slowly. By the late 1890s, he and his wife Rose, also a Russian Jewish immigrant born in Romania, were running a small candy and novelty shop at 404 Tompkins Avenue in the Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood of Brooklyn. It was not a large operation. It was the kind of place that sold penny candy to neighborhood children and handmade stuffed animals to their mothers. Rose sewed the animals herself, by hand, at night, after the shop closed. In November 1902, a political cartoon appeared in the Washington Post. The drawing, by Clifford K. Berryman, showed President Theodore Roosevelt on a hunting trip in Mississippi, refusing to shoot a small, helpless bear cub that had been tied to a tree by his hunting companions and presented as an easy kill. Roosevelt, by all accounts, found the gesture unsporting and declined. Berryman captured the moment with a bear cub that was round and wide-eyed and impossible not to feel something for. Morris Mictum saw the cartoon. He understood something immediately, not as a sentimentalist, but as a man who had spent years watching what made people stop walking and look at a shop window. He asked Rose to sew a version of the bear. She made it from velvet with shoe-button eyes. Morris placed it in the window of the candy shop with a handwritten sign, Teddy's Bear. It sold the same day. According to Mictum family accounts, Morris wrote to President Roosevelt asking permission to use the name. Roosevelt, who famously disliked his childhood nickname, reportedly replied that he doubted his name would be worth much in the bear business. But the Mictums were welcome to it. The letter itself has not survived. What survived was the bear. By 1903, Rose could not sew them fast enough. The couple moved from handmade production to a small manufacturing arrangement. By 1906, the name had shifted from Teddy's Bear to simply Teddy Bear, common noun, American English, permanent fixture of the language. Roosevelt used a version of the Mictum bear as a symbol during his 1904 re-election campaign. The toy was no longer a novelty. It was a category. In 1907, Morris and Rose Mictum formalized what they had built. They founded the Ideal Novelty and Toy Company in Brooklyn in partnership with Butler Brothers, a wholesaler with access to the plush fabrics the bears required and the distribution network the Mictums lacked. The company's first product line was the bear that had started everything. Its second was dolls, composition dolls made of sawdust and glue, advertised as unbreakable, which was ambitious but effective marketing for 1907. Morris Mictum was not a toy maker by training. He was a candy shop owner who had recognized a drawing in a newspaper and understood, in the way that certain people understand things before anyone else does, that a child who saw that bear would need to hold one. That instinct, not capital, not connections, not credentials, was the foundation of what would become the largest toy company in America. It would take 30 years to reach that height. It would take another 40 to lose everything. But in 1907, on the ground floor of a Brooklyn building, the first boxes were packed and shipped. They sold before anyone had time to doubt them. Morris Mictum did not live to see what Ideal became. He died in Brooklyn on July 21, 1938, at 68 years old, the same year his wife Rose had died, just months before him. The company they had built from a candy shop and a velvet bear was worth roughly $2 million at the time of his death. Significant for a Brooklyn immigrant who had arrived penniless 50 years earlier, modest by the standard of what was coming. His son Benjamin took over. Benjamin Michtom had grown up inside the company, joined formally in 1923, and understood the business the way a second-generation operator understands it. Not with the founder's raw instinct, but with something more deliberate, an eye for talent, a feel for the market, and the discipline to build infrastructure around good ideas rather than simply chasing them. The man Benjamin brought in to help him build that infrastructure was Lionel Weintraub. Weintraub joined Ideal in 1941, the same year the company purchased its first 2 injection molding machines, steel tools that forced liquid plastic into precision-cut cavities under high pressure and ejected finished parts in seconds. It was a technology that would define American toy manufacturing for the next 4 decades. Ideal was not the first company to use it, but Weintraub would help make Ideal the company that used it best. The timing of his arrival was not coincidental with history. In 1943, a printing company called Edward Langer Printing went bankrupt, and its factory at Jamaica Avenue and 184th Place in Hollis, Queens went to auction. Ideal bought the building for what records suggest was a fraction of its value. The Hollis factory would become Ideal's home for the next 4 decades, a sprawling industrial complex in a working-class Queens neighborhood, where the parking lots filled before sunrise and the injection presses ran in shifts around the clock. During the World War II years, Ideal's value climbed from $2 million to $11 million. The war had not sent Ideal into military production in the documented way it had transformed some manufacturers, but the plastics technology the company was mastering, the factory space it had acquired, and the workforce it was building in Hollis would power everything that followed. What followed was the American baby boom, and Ideal was ready for it in a way that few companies in any industry were ready for anything. The post-war American family was buying houses in the suburbs, appliances for the kitchen, cars for the driveway, and toys. More toys for more children, with more disposable income behind each purchase than the American market had ever seen. Ideal understood this before the data confirmed it. The injection presses in Hollis ran at capacity. New lines went into development faster than old ones could be retired. The product that defined Ideal's post-war identity was not a new one. Betsy Wetsy had launched in 1934, a soft-bodied baby doll with a rubber head that could drink water from a bottle and, true to her name, produce a corresponding result. By the late 1940s, she had been in production for 15 years and showed no signs of slowing. The Toy Industry Association would later name Betsy Wetsy to its Century of Toys list, one of the 100 most memorable and creative toys of the 20th century. She was named, with the particular sentimentality of that era, after the daughter of Abraham Katz, Ideal's chief executive. That detail matters. Ideal was still, in the late 1940s, a family company in the most literal sense, a place where the chief executive named a best-selling doll after his daughter, where the founder's son ran the operation, where the connections between the people who made the toys and the children who played with them were not abstract. That connection was about to be tested by scale. The 1950s brought Ideal to a height that Morris Michtom, in his candy shop on Tompkins Avenue, could not have imagined. The Tony doll, introduced at the end of the 1940s in partnership with the Tony Home Permanent Wave Company, let little girls give their dolls the same hairstyles their mothers were wearing. The Miss Revlon series followed in the 1950s, a fashion doll line tied to the cosmetics giant, which understood that a doll carrying a famous name moved off shelves faster than a doll carrying none. Ideal had been practicing this logic since the Shirley Temple doll of 1934, the company's best-selling single product for years, a high-quality licensed doll that came with the actress's famous curly hair and outfits from her films. By the mid-1950s, Ideal had refined the licensed character doll into a reliable commercial formula. But the two people who gave that formula its physical form were not executives. They worked in the design rooms. Judith Albert joined Ideal in 1960 as a doll designer. She would stay for 22 years. The dolls she worked on during that period, Tammy from 1962, the Chrissy line from 1969, the Flatsy series, were not simply products. They were exercises in understanding what a girl of a specific age, in a specific decade, needed a doll to be. Tammy was deliberately not Barbie. Less glamorous, more approachable, a teenager rather than a fashion icon. She had a family line built around her, a mother, a brother, a boyfriend. Tamia sold in numbers that trade publications of the period described as competitive with Mattel's flagship. Not dominant, competitive, which, against Barbie, was its own kind of achievement. Working alongside Albert, master sculptor Vincent J. DeFilippo spent 27 years giving Ideal's dolls their faces. His hands shaped the features of Chrissy, of Thumbelina, of the Flatsy line, the flat vinyl dolls in their picture frame packaging that children in the late 1960s either loved completely or found faintly unsettling. DeFilippo's work was not credited on the box. It never is in the toy industry. But it was his eye that determined whether a child reaching into a shelf felt something or didn't. By 1971, Ideal joined the New York Stock Exchange. The company was valued at $71 million, 35 times what it had been worth when Morris Mictum died 33 years earlier. It was one of the 3 largest toy companies in the United States, alongside Mattel and Hasbro. The factory at Hollis had outgrown itself. Ideal wanted to build a new plant in College Point, Queens, a site that would later become Shea Stadium, but could not reach a deal with the Lindsay administration. Instead, the company opened a second facility in Newark, New Jersey in the early 1970s, while Hollis continued to run. Hundreds of workers, 2 facilities, $71 million, the largest doll manufacturer in America. And still, almost no one outside the trade knew the name Ideal. That was not an accident, it was a pattern. And patterns, when left unexamined long enough, become fate. There is a particular kind of vulnerability that looks like strength for a very long time. Ideal had built its business on products, not on itself. Every great success the company had ever produced, the teddy bear, the Shirley Temple doll, the Tony line, the Betsy Wetsy, the Rubik's Cube, carried someone else's name, someone else's face, someone else's identity on the box. Ideal was the factory behind the curtain, the manufacturer of beloved things. The company whose name appeared in small print on the bottom of the package, below the character, below the license, below the brand that actually moved the product. This was not incompetence. In the 1930s and 1940s, it was sound strategy. Licensing a famous face, Shirley Temple, Miss Revlon, Howdy Doody, was how a toy company bought immediate credibility in a crowded market. The character sold the toy. The toy built the company. The company stayed quiet and kept manufacturing. The problem arrived in the 1960s, when 2 competitors decided that the company itself could be the brand. Mattel understood this first. The Hot Wheels launch of 1968 was not just a product introduction, it was an identity statement. Hot Wheels were Mattel cars. The name on the package was Mattel's name, not a licensed character's name, not a celebrity's name. Mattel spent heavily on television advertising to put its own name in front of children, not just its products. By the early 1970s, American children didn't ask their parents for a specific doll. They asked for a Mattel doll. The company had become the noun. Hasbro executed the same logic through G.I. Joe, launched in 1964. G.I. Joe was a Hasbro creation, not a license, not a borrowed face, but a wholly owned character whose success built directly into the Hasbro name. When G.I. Joe succeeded, Hasbro succeeded. The equity accumulated in one place. Ideal watched both of these developments and did not change course. This was not negligence visible to anyone inside the building at the time. Ideal's licensed products were still selling. The Tammy line was competitive with Barbie. The motorific slot car sets, battery-powered cars running on snap-together plastic track, introduced in 1964, were selling in numbers that filled the Hollis production lines. The company was profitable. The logic of doing what had always worked is the most powerful logic in any organization. And in the mid-1960s, what had always worked was still working. But the shelf was changing. Walk into a toy store in 1965, and the organizing principle was character and license. Walk into that same store in 1972, and the organizing principle was beginning to shift toward manufacturer. Parents who had bought Mattel products for 7 years were developing trust in the Mattel name itself. That trust was transferable to new product lines, to new categories, to new decades. Ideal's equivalent trust existed only at the product level. Parents trusted Betsy Wetsy. They trusted the Evel Knievel stunt cycle. They did not, in any documented way, trust Ideal as a company, because Ideal as a company had never asked them to. The Evel Knievel line, launched in the early 1970s, was the clearest example of both Ideal's genius and its structural weakness. The line was genuinely innovative, a 6-inch rubber-bodied figure with a hand-cranked stunt cycle launcher that sent the Daredevil flying across whatever obstacle a child's imagination could construct. It was kinetic. It was dangerous looking. It was everything a boy of 8 wanted from a toy in 1973. It sold in numbers that trade publications of the period called extraordinary. And every unit sold built equity in Evel Knievel, not an Ideal. When Knievel's public image collapsed in late 1977, following a widely reported criminal assault on a former associate, Ideal's primary revenue driver collapsed with him. A New York Times report from December 1977 documented the immediate damage to the company's Daredevil toy sales. Ideal had no brand floor beneath the license to catch the fall. The product had been everything. When the product was gone, there was nothing underneath it. By fiscal year 1979 to 1980, Ideal recorded earnings of $3.7 million on revenues averaging roughly $150 million. That margin, less than 3 cents on every dollar, left no room for error. The error arrived in 1979 in the form of a Hungarian inventor named Erno Rubik. But before the Rubik's Cube reshaped Ideal's final years, the invisible problem had already done its work. Lionel Weintraub, who had guided the company through its peak decades, was 61 years old. The creative team that had given Ideal its best products, Albert, De Filippo, the designers and engineers who understood the company's identity from the inside, was aging alongside the executives. New blood existed, but it operated inside a structure that had not fundamentally rethought itself since the baby boom. The injection presses in Hollis were older. The product pipeline was thinner. The competition, Mattel and Hasbro, both of them now operating with the full advantage of name brand recognition and the television advertising budgets to reinforce it, was larger, faster, and better capitalized than Ideal had ever been. Judith Albert was still at her drafting table. De Filippo's hands were still shaping faces in the sculpture room. The parking lot at Jamaica Avenue still filled before sunrise. But the building that housed all of it was standing on a narrower foundation than anyone on the inside fully understood. And coming down the road, in a cardboard box from Budapest with a Hungarian patent and a name not yet attached to it, was the toy that would make everything worse by briefly making everything better. In 1979, a Hungarian architecture professor named Erno Rubik arrived at the New York Toy Fair with a small plastic cube. Rubik had invented the puzzle 6 years earlier, originally as a teaching tool to help his students understand three-dimensional spatial relationships. The cube had 6 faces, each divided into 9 smaller squares, each face a different color. The goal was to scramble it and restore it to its original state. The mechanism was a marvel of mechanical engineering. 26 smaller cubes rotating independently around a central axis, held together by tension alone, capable of generating more than 43 quintillion possible configurations. Rubik called it the Magic Cube. He had been selling it in Hungary since 1977 through the State Toy Company with modest success. What he needed was an American partner with the manufacturing infrastructure and retail relationships to bring it to the world's largest toy market. Ideal was the company that said yes. The decision was made at the executive level in 1979. Ideal licensed the puzzle, renamed it the Rubik's Cube, a name that placed the inventor front and center, in keeping with Ideal's long habit of building around external identity rather than its own, and launched it in American stores in 1980. What happened next was not a product launch, it was a detonation. By 1981, the Rubik's Cube was the fastest-selling toy in American history. Department stores rationed their inventory. Hobby shops ordered in quantities they had never used for a single product. The cube appeared on the cover of magazines that did not cover toys. Mathematicians wrote papers about it. Children who had never shown interest in puzzles spent hours on bedroom floors, rotating faces, chasing the solution. Adults who had never played with toys bought it at airport newsstands. Ideal's revenues, already running at roughly $150 million annually, surged. The margins improved. The bleeding from the post-Knievel years appeared to have stopped. For the first time in nearly a decade, Ideal looked like a company with momentum. In May 1981, trying to protect that momentum, Ideal filed civil suits against dozens of distributors and retailers selling knockoff cubes, cheaper imitations that had flooded the market within months of the original's success. The suits were a signal of how seriously Ideal was treating the cube's commercial importance. They were also, in retrospect, a signal of how completely the company had allowed a single product to become its entire strategy. That same month, May 1981, Joseph Winkler was named Ideal's new president. Lionel Weintraub, who had run the company through its greatest years, stepped back to chairman and CEO, a title that carried authority on paper but signaled to anyone reading the organizational shift carefully that a transition was underway. Weintraub had joined Ideal in 1941 when its value was $2 million. He had built it to $71 million. He was now presiding over a company whose fortunes rested almost entirely on a plastic cube invented by a Hungarian professor. The cube's collapse came faster than anyone at Ideal was prepared for. By late 1981, the first signs were visible to retailers. The initial wave of demand, the buyers who had to have it, who searched 3 stores to find one, who gave it as Christmas gifts with the urgency of a limited supply, had been satisfied. What remained was the secondary market. The people who wanted one because everyone else had one. That market was thinner, and it was already filling with cheap knockoffs that Ideal's lawsuits had not succeeded in removing from shelves. The New York Times reported in October 1982 that the Rubik's Cube craze had ended. The framing was blunt, the cube had not faded, it had collapsed. Retail orders dried up. Inventory that had been rationed the previous Christmas sat unsold on shelves the following spring. Ideal's financial results for fiscal year 1980 to 1981 showed the damage that had been building before the cube and was now accelerating without it, a loss of $15.5 million. On revenues that had averaged $150 million annually, a $15 million loss was not a crisis that restructuring alone could address. It was evidence of a structural problem that the Rubik's Cube had temporarily papered over, and that the cube's collapse had now exposed in full. The invisible problem that had been building since the late 1960s, the absence of brand identity, the dependence on external licenses, the failure to build the kind of consumer trust that Mattel and Hasbro had spent a decade constructing, was no longer invisible. It was a $15 million hole in the balance sheet, in a year when the company had no equivalent product in development to fill it. Judith Albert was still at Ideal when the financial results were announced. She had been designing dolls for the company for 21 years. DeFilippo had spent 2 decades shaping faces in the sculpture room. The workers at Hollis had run their shifts through the boom and were still running them through the collapse. In 1982, Ideal moved its headquarters from Hollis, Queens, the building it had occupied since 1943. The factory on Jamaica Avenue, where hundreds of workers had built the toys that furnished 4 decades of American childhood, to Harmon Meadow, New Jersey. The physical departure from Queens was not announced as the ending it was. It was presented as operational consolidation. That is how endings are usually announced by the people who cannot bring themselves to call them endings. In April 1982, CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System, a television and radio network, purchased the Ideal Toy Company for approximately $58 million. The people who negotiated the sale understood the number. Not one of them, on the CBS side of the table, understood what they were buying. The CBS executives who flew to New Jersey to finalize the Ideal acquisition in the spring of 1982 were not bad people. They were competent people operating inside a logic that made complete sense within their frame of reference, and made no sense at all inside a toy company. The logic was this: CBS was a media company with cash, and the toy industry in 1982 appeared, from the outside, to be a growth sector. Children's television programming was expanding. Licensing opportunities between entertainment properties and toy lines were multiplying. A toy company paired with a broadcasting network seemed, on the surface, like a natural fit. The executives who approved the $58 million purchase believed they were buying access to a market they could amplify through their existing media infrastructure. What they were actually buying was a company whose entire value existed in relationships, institutional memory, and creative talent, none of which appeared on the balance sheet, and none of which CBS knew how to evaluate. Lionel Weintraub understood the distinction. He had spent 41 years inside Ideal understanding it. The company's ability to read what a child wanted, not what a focus group said a child wanted, not what a licensing spreadsheet projected a child would want, but what a child standing in a toy aisle on a Saturday morning in November would actually reach for, was not a process that could be documented in an acquisition memo. It lived in the people. It lived in the institutional habits of a company that had been making toys since 1907. When CBS took control, Weintraub's operational authority ended. The transition was managed with the language of corporate courtesy, titles retained, announcements carefully worded, but the reality was unambiguous. The man who had built Ideal's peak decades no longer had the final word on what Ideal would make or how it would make it. Judith Albert left the company in 1982. She had joined as a doll designer in 1960, 22 years earlier, when Ideal was still operating from its Queens identity, still run by people who had grown up inside it. She had designed through the Tammy years, through Chrissy, through Flatsy, through 2 decades of American girlhood. Her departure coincided precisely with the CBS acquisition. Whether she left because of it or whether the timing was coincidence, the record does not say with certainty. What the record shows is that in the year CBS arrived, one of the 2 people most responsible for the physical identity of Ideal's best products walked out the door. DeFilippo's 27 years of sculpting ended around 1980, just before the acquisition. The hands that had shaped Chrissy's face and Thumbelina's expression were already gone from the building before CBS signed the paperwork. The creative infrastructure that had made Ideal's peak possible was dismantling itself, one departure at a time, in the years before and immediately after the sale. CBS did not cause every departure, but CBS arrived at precisely the moment when the departures had left the building most vulnerable, and brought nothing to replace what it left. What CBS brought was process, reporting structures, quarterly targets, brand managers who had experience with television properties and very little experience with the particular alchemy of a toy that a 7-year-old would carry to school on Monday to show the other kids. The Hollis factory, which had run injection presses since 1943, was now operating as a satellite of a New Jersey headquarters that was itself operating as a division of a New York broadcasting company. The chain of decision-making between a designer's sketch and a production run had lengthened in ways that the toy calendar, which demanded that Christmas product be locked by February, manufactured by June, and shipped by September, could not easily accommodate. CBS did not know what to do with Ideal. This is not an interpretation. It is the most accurate description of the 3 years that followed the acquisition. The toy division produced products. Some of them sold adequately. None of them recaptured the cultural velocity that the Rubik's Cube had briefly generated, or the sustained commercial engine that the Evel Knievel line had run at its peak. The product pipeline that Weintraub's team had developed over decades was being managed now by people whose primary skill set was broadcasting, not toy development. The board game division, Mousetrap, Tip-It, Battling Tops, the games that had been reliable performers since the early 1960s, continued to generate revenue. But board games in 1983 were facing the same pressure that every analog toy category was beginning to feel. The early Atari generation had arrived, and children who had a television set and a game cartridge were spending less time at a dining room table rolling dice. By 1984, CBS had reached the conclusion that most conglomerates reach when they acquire a business they do not understand. They want it out. The toy division had not performed to the projections that had justified the $58 million purchase price 2 years earlier. The media synergies that had seemed logical on the acquisition memo had not materialized in any meaningful commercial form. CBS sold Ideal to Viewmaster International in 1984. Viewmaster International was the company behind the Viewmaster Stereoscope, the red plastic viewer that generations of American children had used to look at 3-dimensional image reels of national parks, cartoon characters, and space missions. It was a beloved product with a loyal consumer base and a strong retail presence in the gift and novelty category. It was not a company with the creative infrastructure or the manufacturing depth to absorb a full-line toy company and restore it to competitive health. Viewmaster International renamed itself Viewmaster Ideal following the acquisition. The new name was intended to signal continuity, to communicate to retailers and consumers that the Ideal brand was still present, still active, still the company that had made Betsy Wetsy and the Evel Knievel stunt cycle. What it actually signaled to anyone paying careful attention was that ideal had become an adjective, a modifier attached to another company's name. The brand that had never built its own identity in front of consumers was now grammatically subordinate to a brand that made red plastic viewers. The workers who remained in the Newark facility, in whatever production remained, were making toys under a name that their employer had purchased and appended to its own. The institutional memory that Weintraub had carried, that Albert had carried, that DeFilippo had carried, was not in the building. It was in the people who had left. Viewmaster Ideal ran the operation for 5 years. 5 years of declining catalog, narrowing product lines, and the particular exhaustion of a brand being managed by people whose primary expertise lay elsewhere. In 1989, Tyco Toys arrived with $43.9 million and a purchase agreement, the third owner in 7 years. Each one had paid less than the one before. Each one had understood less than the one before. And the name that had never been loud enough, never been present enough, never been its own enough, was about to be passed one final time. Tyco Toys was not a predator in the traditional sense. It was a company with genuine ambitions, a Mount Laurel, New Jersey operation that had built itself into the third largest toy company in the United States through a combination of radio-controlled vehicles, licensed preschool products, and a willingness to acquire brands that larger competitors had overlooked. By 1989, Tyco had taken itself public, expanded aggressively, and was generating revenues that put it in legitimate competition with Mattel and Hasbro for retail shelf space. When Tyco purchased Viewmaster Ideal in May 1989 for $43.9 million, the acquisition made strategic sense on paper. The Viewmaster line added a recognizable product with strong gift market penetration. The Ideal name added catalog depth. The Magnadoodle magnetic drawing toy, a Viewmaster Ideal product that would eventually sell 40 million units worldwide, was alone worth serious consideration. What Tyco was less equipped to handle was the Ideal identity itself, not the products. The identity, the accumulated weight of 82 years of American toy manufacturing, the institutional knowledge of what had made Betsy Wetsy work in 1934, and what had made the Evel Knievel stunt cycle work in 1973. The understanding of how to build a toy that a child would carry to school on Monday. That understanding had left the building in stages. Weintraub's departure in 1982, Albert's in 1982, DeFilippo's around 1980. The designers and engineers who had staffed the Hollis factory through its peak decades had dispersed into the industry, into retirement, into other lives. What remained was a name on a license agreement and a catalog of products that other companies were now manufacturing, with varying degrees of fidelity to the originals. Tyco ran the Ideal line for 8 years. 8 years during which the American toy market underwent changes that would have challenged a focused, fully staffed, creatively energized company, let alone a brand being managed as one component of a multi-acquisition conglomerate. The video game market, which had wobbled after the Atari collapse of 1983, had recovered decisively with the Nintendo Entertainment System and was now pulling discretionary spending away from traditional toy categories in volumes that no amount of licensing or product innovation could fully offset. The Ideal products that survived into the Tyco era were the ones with the most durable mechanics. Mousetrap, which required no batteries and rewarded patience. The board games that had outlasted every trend since the early 1960s. But even these were selling into a market that was reorganizing itself around screens, and the reorganization was not reversing. In November 1996, Mattel announced it would acquire Tyco Toys. The deal was valued at $755 million, the price of absorbing the third largest toy company in America, including everything Tyco had accumulated across its years of acquisition. The Federal Trade Commission approved the merger in March 1997. Nearly 10% of the combined workforce, roughly 2,700 jobs, was eliminated in the restructuring that followed. Somewhere inside that restructuring was the Ideal Toy Company. The Mattel absorption of 1997 was not the dramatic closure that a 75-year story deserved. There was no final production run announced, no ceremony at a factory that was no longer Ideal's factory, No acknowledgement in the press releases that accompany the Tyco-Mattel merger that something called the Ideal Toy Company, the company that had given America the teddy bear, Betsy Wetsy, the Shirley Temple doll, Mr. Machine, Mousetrap, Motorific, the Evil Knievel stunt cycle, and the Rubik's Cube, was ending. It ended the way most things end inside conglomerate mergers, administratively. A line item in a restructuring document. A trademark transferred. A catalog absorbed or discontinued. A name that had appeared on toy boxes since 1907 quietly retired from active use. In 1997, Ideal Toy Company filed for bankruptcy. The Ideal trademarks and the majority of toy molds that Hasbro and Mattel had not claimed were purchased by Jay Horowitz of American Plastic Equipment, who later transferred all rights to a subsidiary called American Classic Toys. It was a name that carried no recognition, served no retail presence, and generated no cultural signal that anything of consequence had passed through its hands. The products themselves were scattered with a thoroughness that Morris Michtom, the candy shop owner from Brooklyn, who had started all of this with a velvet bear and a newspaper cartoon, could not have imagined as a possible fate. The Rubik's Cube, Ideal's last great commercial triumph, the toy that had briefly made the company's balance sheet look healthy before collapsing it, went to Hasbro. The Magic 8-Ball, a product Ideal had carried for decades, went to Mattel. Mousetrap, the board game that had been a reliable performer since 1963, went to Hasbro's MB Games division, where it continues to be sold today under a brand that bears no connection to the Queen's factory, where it was developed. Each product found a new home. None of them carried the name Ideal with them. Now, apply the staccato rule, the final collapse, written in the rhythm of doors closing. The bankruptcy filing was processed in 1997. The trademarks were sold. The molds followed. The catalog was divided. The name went to a company no one had heard of. The products went to companies that did not need the name. The factory in Hollis had been gone since 1982. The designers were gone before that. The founder had been gone since 1938. What remained was a legal entity. Then the legal entity was gone too. 90 years. A candy shop in Brooklyn to the largest toy company in America. The teddy bear to the Rubik's Cube. Morris and Rose Michtom to Lionel Weintraub to Judith Albert to Vincent DiFilippo. An unbroken chain of people who understood, in their hands and their eyes and their instincts, what a child needed a toy to be. And at the end of the chain, a line item in a Mattel restructuring document. A trademark purchased by a company called American Classic Toys. A factory in Queens that was now a garment warehouse with a rooftop greenhouse growing lettuce. The name Ideal appeared on toy packaging for 90 years. In that entire span, it never once became the thing that Mattel and Hasbro understood a name needed to become, the reason a child pointed at the shelf. The products were the reason. The products are gone now, scattered, licensed, reissued by companies that bought the rights without buying the memory. And the name that was never loud enough, never present enough, never its own enough, the name that had stood behind the teddy bear and the stunt cycle and the Rubik's Cube and never once stepped in front of them, is the name that no one remembers. That was not an accident. It was the whole story. The building is still there. 184, 10 and 184, 60 Jamaica Avenue, Hollis, Queens. The factory that Ideal purchased from a bankrupt printing company in 1943. The building where the injection presses ran in shifts, where Betsy Wetsy came off the line, and motorific cars were boxed, and the Evil Knievel stunt cycle was assembled for its first Christmas season, is still standing. It did not burn. It was not demolished. It was not replaced by condominiums, or a parking structure, or the kind of featureless warehouse that erases industrial history without acknowledging it. What replaced the toy factory eventually was a rooftop greenhouse. Gotham Greens, a commercial urban agriculture company, constructed what was at the time the largest rooftop greenhouse in America atop the Hollis building. Thousands of square feet of glass and growing trays, producing salad greens for New York City grocery stores, sitting on the roof of the place where American children's toys were made for 4 decades. The building itself became a multi-tenant commercial property, home to fashion companies and logistics operations, and the kind of quiet industrial tenancy that fills former manufacturing space in Outer Borough, New York. The French Connection clothing company established its New York headquarters there. Hanky Panky Lingerie occupied space in the building. Lettuce grew on the roof. There is no plaque, no marker, no acknowledgement at street level that the building at Jamaica Avenue and 184th Place was once the physical center of the largest toy company in America. A person walking past it today would see a large, nondescript industrial structure, the kind of building that exists in every outer borough, that blends into the landscape of working commercial New York, that gives nothing away about what happened inside it. This is, in its way, a precise physical expression of everything that was wrong with Ideal's relationship to its own identity. The company that never put its name in front of its products left a building that carries no record of what it was. The invisibility was not just a marketing failure, it was a habit of mind that persisted all the way to the physical address. What the silence cost is not easily calculated in dollars, though the acquisition chain offers one version of the accounting. $58 million in 1982, down to $43.9 million in 1989, absorbed into a $755 million Tyco deal in 1997, in which Ideal was a rounding error. Each transaction valued the name less than the one before, because the name had never been taught to carry its own weight. What the silence cost in human terms is harder to quantify and more important to understand. Judith Albert, who spent 22 years designing dolls that millions of American girls carried through their childhoods, died in 1998 at the age of 59. Her New York Times obituary ran with a headline that captured, without intending to, the precise irony of her employer's entire history. Judith Albert, 59, toy designer whose doll led to buyer frenzy. The doll led to the frenzy. The designer's name was in the headline. The company's name was not. Vincent DeFilippo's 27 years of sculpting produced faces that appeared in toy boxes across 5 decades of American childhood. His name appeared on none of them. Lionel Weintraub built Ideal from a $2 million family operation into a $71 million public company. Over 4 decades of sustained creative and commercial judgment. When CBS bought the company he had built, he stepped back from operational control and eventually from the industry. The institutional memory he carried, the accumulated knowledge of how to read a market, how to develop a product, how to connect a toy to the child who needed it, left with him and was not replaced. Morris and Rose Michtom are buried in New York. The bear Rose sewed in their candy shop on Tompkins Avenue, the original Teddy's bear, the one that started everything, is at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. It arrived there in 1964, donated by the Roosevelt family after Kermit Roosevelt's children briefly refused to give it up. It sits in a display case, properly preserved, properly labeled, a genuine artifact of American cultural history. The label identifies the bear. It identifies Theodore Roosevelt. It identifies the year and the origin. The name Michtom appears in the descriptive text. The name Ideal does not need to appear. By 1964, even while the company was still running its presses in Hollis, still shipping toys to Woolworths and Sears and hobby shops across the country, the connection between the bear and the company that had grown from it was already the kind of thing that required explanation. That required explanation. A company 90 years old, the inventor of the American teddy bear, and its own origin story needed a footnote to connect it to its name. That is what the silence cost. Not the $58 million, not the $43.9 million, not the jobs eliminated in the Mattel restructuring. The silence cost Ideal the one thing that could have saved it when everything else went wrong. The silence cost it being remembered. The name Ideal exists today on paper. American Classic Toys, the subsidiary that acquired the Ideal trademarks and remaining molds from Jay Horowitz's American Plastic Equipment following the 1997 bankruptcy, holds the rights. It is not a company most toy collectors have encountered at retail. It does not occupy shelf space at Target or Walmart. It does not run television advertising or maintain a social media presence aimed at children. It is, in the precise legal sense, the successor to the Ideal Toy Company. In every other sense, it is something else entirely. The products that defined Ideal's 90 years have fared better than the name. Mousetrap, the Rube Goldberg-inspired board game that Ideal introduced in 1963, the cascading contraption of plastic ramps and bathtubs and diving figures that required 20 minutes to assemble and produce 30 seconds of deeply satisfying mechanical chaos, is sold today by Hasbro. It remains in production. It remains recognizable. Children who play it today are playing a direct descendant of the game that came off the Hollis production line 60 years ago, with no knowledge of the company that invented it. The Rubik's Cube is sold today by Hasbro in the United States. It has never stopped selling. Estimates place total worldwide sales across all manufacturers at over 500 million units, making it the best-selling puzzle toy in human history. Erno Rubik's name is on it. The word Hasbro is on the packaging. The name Ideal appears nowhere. The Magic 8 Ball is sold by Mattel. The Evel Knievel license has passed through several hands and continues to generate collector interest and occasional reissue products. An original Evel Knievel stunt cycle set in good condition, the hand-cranked launcher, the rubber-bodied figure in his white jumpsuit, the ramp accessories, sells today in the range of $80 to $150 on the secondary market, depending on completeness. Unbuilt motorific sets in original packaging command similar prices among baby boomer toy collectors who remember the battery-powered cars running on snap-together track across living room floors in 1966. The surprise that the official record does not fully capture is this. The Ideal factory on Jamaica Avenue did not simply close and fall silent when the company departed in 1982. The building kept going. New tenants moved in. Fashion companies occupied the floors where injection presses had run. A silkscreen supply company moved in the same year Ideal moved out and stayed for decades. The French Connection, Hanky Panky, and on the roof, the rooftop greenhouse, growing salad greens for New York City, drawing state energy grants, redefining the Jamaica Avenue skyline in a way that the toy factory never had. The building outlasted the company by decades. It is still in use today. The presses are long gone. The molds are scattered. The designers and engineers and sculptors who gave the building its purpose have retired or died. But the structure itself, the factory that Lionel Weintraub purchased from a bankrupt printing company in 1943 for a fraction of its value, the building where Betsy Wetsy and Chrissy and the Evel Knievel stunt cycle were made, is standing. What Ideal built lasted longer than Ideal. The toys outlasted the company. The building outlasted the brand. The bear that Rose Mictum sewed in a candy shop in Brooklyn in 1902 outlasted everything. The company, the factory, the name, the legal entity, the trademark, the acquisition chain, the bankruptcy filing, all of it. It sits in a glass case in Washington, D.C., properly preserved, properly labeled. A velvet bear with shoe-button eyes made by hand by a woman who could not keep up with demand and so built a company to help her. The company is gone. The bear is still there. Somewhere tonight, in a house in Ohio, or a garage in Arizona, or an attic in New Jersey, someone is opening a box they found at an estate sale last weekend. A motorific set, still in original packaging. The car is still smelling faintly of the plastic that came off the Hollis line in 1966, and they are reading the small print on the bottom of the box. Ideal Toy Company, Hollis, New York. They may not recognize the name, but they remember exactly how it felt to be the child who held this.